walk in darkness, was a pure light. Christ. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts. We forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, power, and the glory.
This House is in session. Minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022 to be confirmed. Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the aforesaid minutes be confirmed.
Questions that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed. All those who are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are hereby confirmed.
You see correct spelling? Correct spelling? Announcements by Your Honor the Speaker. Messages from Her Excellency the President, petitions, papers, government notices.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to give notice of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2022 and also to give notice of the Road Traffic Learners Permits and Driving Licenses Validation Bill 2022.
Private members' notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees, first readings of bills.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the first reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2022 and also to move the first reading of the Road Traffic Learners Permits and Driving Licenses Validation Bill 2022.
The question is that the aforementioned bills be read the first time. All those who are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, or replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
So beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42, subsection 5, 43, and 44 for the remainder of the day's sitting.
The question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those who are members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business, sir.
Government Business is the order of the day.
Order number 7, in the name of the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Senior Minister, Minister of Transport Works and Water Resources, to move the second reading of the Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2022.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I would kindly ask you, Mr. Speaker, to allow both of the bills which are on the order paper to be taken as one cognate debate, given that they're both inextricably linked. That would be the Road Traffic Amendment Bill and the Road Traffic Learners Permits and Driving License Validation Bill. Orders 7 and 8 respectively.
The question is that orders 7 and 8 be treated as a cognate debate because they're inextricably linked. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against it, please say no. We think the ayes have it. 7 and 8 can be read and debated as a cognate debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise, sir, this morning very relieved, I must say, to be able to bring these two pieces of legislation to this chamber, primarily because over the course of the last few months, there has been much discontent amongst persons who wanted the opportunity to be able to obtain a heavy goods license from the Barbados Licensing Authority, but unfortunately could not do so because steps had to be taken by the Chief Licensing Officer to suspend the issuance of those licenses. This morning, sir, I will attempt to go back to come forward because I think it is important to clearly explain what has transpired that has led such a decision to have had to have been taken by this administration and in turn by the Chief Licensing Officer. Because that decision to suspend a few months ago caused a number of young people, as well as a number of old people as well, who would have wanted the opportunity to be able to be gainfully employed, driving heavy goods vehicles, to have lost that opportunity while that suspension was ongoing. And so this morning's debate really is to, I would have to say, urgently address the issues that arose as a result of some challenges that we face at the Barbados Licensing Authority. Now, sir, the Road Traffic Act has been amended on several occasions. It is perhaps one of the most live pieces of legislation that I think exists. Matters relating to roads, relating to traffic, relating to various offenses on the highway have over the decades been the subject of much discussion, but also much significant amendment as well. And back in 2017, the then administration, on the eve of an election, took a decision to come with a slew of amendments to the Road Traffic Act at the time, which included a number of things ranging from the introduction of the breathalyzer tests. It also touched on the issue of persons using cell phones. It also related to a change in the minimum age as well of eligibility for persons who were driving a public service vehicle and also persons operating a motor tractor and heavy goods vehicles. And those radical changes in terms of the then legislation, there would have been consultation with some of the stakeholders, but at the time, the Barbados Bar Association, for instance, had not been consulted. I recall in this chamber, the current Prime Minister and member for St. Michael Northeast making the very strident point that the administration then had rushed this piece of legislation and amendment to the Act and had not engaged in the level of consultation with the various stakeholders that were required. A number of offenses were being created, Mr. Speaker, which at the time even extended to persons who would have been parking in areas designed and dedicated for persons who were disabled. And no issue there in principle, Mr. Speaker, because for almost a decade before, many of those persons who had disabilities had been engaging in serious protests to be able to have the areas across the country designated for parking and to create offenses as a result of persons who might have ventured to park in those spaces. So the legislation was quite far-reaching in terms of the changes that were made, And while I believe, and I think we can all accept that those changes may have been necessary, one of the things that we certainly criticized at the time, and certainly the general public, was the fact that the level of consultation and the deep discussion that perhaps may have been needed with the general public had not taken place in relation to the changes that were intended to arise as a result of the amendment to the legislation. Now, the biggest challenge perhaps came where around the same time, as is to some extent the case today, they found ourselves in a situation where the public service vehicles were wreaking havoc on our roads. We had, and if you cast your mind back, Mr. Speaker, there were complaints not just of the loud music on the vehicles, and certainly music that was perhaps vulgar at times. There was also concerns of people stopping at areas that were not designated for those vehicles to pull off on the side of the road. There were concerns about vehicles speeding, and generally there was an uproar in the country regarding the driving by some of the persons who operated these vehicles on our road and the level of lawlessness that was permeating in our society. I have checked with the chief licensing officer who would have served on the then committee, trying to find out whether at the time when the amendment to Section 69 was made, whether at that time, in an effort to try to address the issue of those who were being reckless on our roads in relation to public service vehicles, whether it perhaps was not an oversight in terms of the amendment that was made to the legislation, or if it was intentional. And sir, I haven't been able to find out truthfully whether it was either of the two. But what I do know is that that amendment that had been made resulted then in the age limit for persons who were going to acquire a public service vehicle license having to be age 25. It also required then for the first time for persons who were seeking to have a heavy goods vehicle license also having to have attained the age of 25, sir. So we came to office in 2018, and there seems to have been no discussion whatsoever regarding the changes that had been made to the Road Traffic Act in relation to, in particular, this particular provision. And as a consequence, for the past 5 years, licenses have been issued to persons under the age of 25 for heavy goods vehicles, licenses, in breach of the 2017 road traffic legislation. That resulted, sir, in a call from the Barbados Police Service to the Chief Licensing Officer highlighting this problem, because it essentially meant that the service was unable to arrest persons because they could produce a valid license issued by the Barbados Licensing Authority indicating that they were fit and proper to be on the roads of this country. So it created an immediate eye-opener, I suppose, some 5 years later, as to what had been transpiring over the course of the past few years. Immediately, the Chief Licensing Officer sought, with that information, to suspend the issuance of any permits, which obviously impacted a number of persons who were on various programs in the Ministry of Youth and Community Empowerment. Many people who certainly under this administration, sir, we have been attempting to empower, because there are young people out there who are at the age of 18, having come through formal education, who have an interest in being able to drive not just a vehicle, but also to drive a heavy goods vehicle, because there seems to be quite a bit of money that can be earned in that particular area. And therefore, this administration is always at the forefront of trying to make sure that we open up new skills areas than the traditional areas for our young people. And so those programs obviously stood to be affected by the knowledge that what had been happening was that these persons now would not be in a position to be able to acquire their actual license, because to do so would obviously be in breach of the legislation. Also affected, sir, would have been persons on at the tertiary institutions as well, who would have been, again, under the age of 25, also pursuing courses, learning to drive heavy goods vehicles, and therefore those individuals also would have been affected. I believe, sir, that over the course of the last few years, there have been about 18 young people who have already attained their licenses. We have about 40 or so that are due to start next year, that fall within that under 25 category. We also have, I believe, another 25 or so who would have been affected by this particular piece of legislation in the Ministry of Youth and Community Empowerment. And it therefore meant, sir, that to continue to uphold the provisions of the legislation in 2017 would have directly impacted on the policy and the vision of this government to be able to empower our people in different areas, especially those under the age of 25. And so we took a decision to consult with the various stakeholders. We had meetings with the Barbados Police Service, who expressed obviously concerns regarding not only the fact that the legislation obviously had been introduced initially in the way that it was, but also that obviously it had made their lives very difficult in terms of being able to pursue action against persons because they were constantly stopping people who actually had a valid driver's license. They also expressed concern, sir, regarding the fact of the lawlessness and the behavior of and I say some because it is not all of the public service vehicle drivers, and a desire to ensure that going forward, while we were correcting this particular piece of this particular amendment that affected this category of persons immediately, that we still needed to make sure that we tightened the rules and the regulations as it related to public service vehicle operators. We engaged with the Ministry of Youth and Community Empowerment. We engaged with the Barbados Vocational Training Board. As I said earlier, they have been at the forefront as well of training a number of young people under the age of 25 that would have been affected. And we engaged with the Barbados Driving School Association. And let me just express my gratitude, sir, as well to this particular association and its leadership, because they were the ones who reached out to me immediately to identify that there was a problem that was affecting a class of persons. Many of them had appointments scheduled as driving instructors. They had put in a lot of hours to ensure that people were able and ready to be able to sit the exams and to sit the tests. And the news that broke in relation to the suspension obviously impacted significantly the ability of those persons to continue to earn, but also their own expectation of these young persons to be able to also acquire their vehicle licenses. And so I must tell you as well, Mr. Speaker and the Chamber, that one of the things that confronted us in our discussions was this issue of whether offenses on our highways are carried out predominantly by persons under the age of 25. The statistics, sir, were not as forthcoming as I would have liked in terms of the data that is available. Nobody could say whether a young man or woman under the age of 25 had been involved in major or serious accidents, and therefore a different rule needed to apply to them. In other words, that we had to carry back up the age to 25 or leave it at 25. No one could say with any certainty that you had to leave the age at the 2017 position, which is that the age for heavy goods vehicles had to be at the age of 25. What, however, we discovered was that between 2018 and 2019, the accident rate amongst drivers under the age of 25 was 11%, and in 2020, the rate was 13%, and the 2021 rate was at 11%. And those figures basically said to all of us that there was not a significant difference in terms of the offenses being caused by persons under the age of 25. And therefore, on that basis, there was no valid reason for us to say that we had to leave the age at the age of 25 for persons who wanted to obtain a heavy goods vehicle, sir. We felt that also in our discussions that, and I can say to this chamber that in the course of the next few weeks, and I'm hoping before the end of this year, I would have made the announcement earlier that we would have been looking at regulating public service vehicles in a major way. We are intending to answer the cries of the public and the users of public service vehicles for those drivers and certainly sometimes the conductors whose behavior is not befitting of the position that they hold, carrying so many lives on a day-to-day basis. And the Transport Authority regulations, which will, I believe, give greater teeth to the Transport Authority in relation to enforcement, will shortly be being approved by Cabinet. Those regulations, sir, will address behavior. It will address the issue of the permits, the licenses. It will also impose a greater responsibilities on the owners of vehicles for the conduct of both drivers as well as conductors. And I think that the cry from the public is one that I don't think that we can continue to ignore. The public service vehicle culture is certainly one that I think has been plaguing us for decades. My personal view, sir, is that we have to move to the direction where not only the regulations are introduced, but we also have to take certain steps to ensure that there is enforcement. Because without the necessary enforcement, without the necessary steps being taken to ensure that people are on the roads to identify the problems that are taking place on our roads and to report that to the Transport Authority so that action can be taken, then the regulations will really mean nothing. And so those regulations are going to provide for the introduction of transport inspectors, who again will be able to assist with the monitoring on the roads to again prevent the police from having, no doubt, to spend so much time dealing with road traffic matters, but to be able to have persons identify some of the problems that we encounter on our roads in relation to these public service vehicles. The truth of the matter is, sir, that those regulations, as I said, while being reviewed by CPC currently, I know that their workload has been quite heavy. And as a consequence, we've had some delays in getting the amendments to the regulations done. But I'm assured that before the end of this year, those, the public can certainly look forward to those changes. And what we anticipate in the coming weeks, therefore, after those regulations have been issued, is obviously a public education campaign that enables the general public, but also the conductors, the owners, and the drivers to better understand their responsibilities. And I say those three categories, but the truth of the matter is that it also places an onus on the general public as well. Because as users of the public service vehicles, the public also has a responsibility as well to ensure that it does not encourage behaviors that can be a danger to others as well. And therefore, I would want to call on all of the stakeholders when we introduce the regulations to really treat to them seriously, to be able to let us, perhaps for the first time, be able to bring the level of regulation that is required in the PSV sector. We've had good support from the associations who themselves have been calling for a number of these changes to be made, and I hope that that is able to trickle down to the actual owners and conductors and operators and to the general public, because at the end of the day, it is important that we have a transportation system that works not just for one individual, but that works for all of society as well. The fact, sir, that the Road Traffic Act has had so many amendments being made to it, has on this occasion as well plagued the CPC with significant challenges in making amendments. I certainly was on the front foot asking them to just kindly make the amendments so that we can empower these young people as quickly as possible. But I was also mindful that the Road Traffic Act is in dire need of an overhaul. And I'm grateful to CPC for acceding to the request and also offering the assistance to not only revamp this piece of legislation in its entirety, but also to look at the Transport Authority Act as well. As you know, our intention is to be able to reform and to improve the operations of these entities. And therefore, I feel that this piecemeal approach that we have been taking to the legislation, I think the time has now come for us to have a complete overhaul. The truth of the matter is that it is not just those pieces of legislation, but there's still a number of pieces of legislation on our statute books that are outdated, that their references to things in them do not relate to a modern day Barbados. And, you know, if I mention even the Highways Act, there's some references in there that speak about carriageways and, you know, all kinds of things that bear no resemblance to the vehicles that we have on our roads today, but rather to a society in which donkey carts were the order of the day. And it therefore means, sir, that while we transform, while we try to improve our road infrastructure, while we try to improve our highways, the reality is that we also have to take some time to be able to do a deep dive into the actual legislation that exists and that governs the ability of the Ministry of Transport Works and Water Resources to be able to effectively carry out a lot of its works. Because none of these persons who will be the beneficiaries of this particular amendment, sir, want to be driving on roads that are not well taken care of, or that we have potholes all over the place, or that are not properly rehabilitated. And therefore, it requires us to not just look at the access to getting the infrastructure done, but we also have to very closely look at the maintenance of our road programs, the responsibility of the public as well for dealing with areas that are within the confines of the highway, close to them, and to remind people of their responsibilities as well. Because I think sometimes people forget that we all live in this Barbados and everything cannot be the domain of government or its institutions alone, but that we also have a responsibility as people who live in this society to also pay attention to things that are happening, sir. Now, sir, I would just mention as well that one of the other things that was done by CPC in relation to this amendment was in relation to Section 2. One of the concerns that they had was that, again, the definition section was mentioning things like contract carriage, hired cars, and self-driven cars. Again, these things all require to be fully fleshed out. But the truth of the matter is that the meanings of the terms have not changed. All that they've done and sought to do in this particular amendment is to try to place them in an alphabetical order in the definition section so that there's greater clarity. But I'm assured that when the time comes for the full overhaul of the legislation, the intention is that those amendments will be made as has been promised by CPC, so that we have a full review of the terminology that is used in the legislation. The fact, sir, also is that in order to make this amendment, as I was said before, there are a couple hundred people who would have received their licenses between 2017 and September 30th. I think from the 11th of December 2017 to the September 30th period. Those persons would have been issued licenses in respect of heavy goods vehicles, motor omnibuses, motor tractors, and public service vehicles. And therefore, the validation bill that is also before this chamber seeks to ensure that the fees that have been charged and collected by the Barbados Revenue Authority in respect of those said learners' permits and driving licenses, that those are indeed validated and therefore validly collected. It essentially means, sir, that nobody is seeking to trouble any of the persons who got their licenses. I am happy if there have been no accidents caused by those individuals, and therefore we are seeking just to regularize what has been the wrong that has been done for the last 5 years by ensuring that those monies that have been collected are validly and properly accounted for by the government. Sir, I want to just briefly also mention this morning, I know when I took up office, there were a number of issues in relation to the Pine location of the licensing authority in relation to the Barbados Revenue Authorities not being at the Pine location. I think the public is well aware that those offices are now well placed back in the Pine. We've seen obviously the traffic coming back to the Pine location, and I think that is of great convenience to members of the public. We have just completed the renovations on the old space which BRA would have occupied, and we have agreed with the Barbados Revenue Authority that by the end of December that they will make the transition back over to that space. Colleagues may recall that we had a situation where there was termite infestation. The building had been closed up for well over a year, and there was almost a stalemate when I took over as it relates to having these works carried out. We've completed that. We've had to dislocate the workers who were in the vehicle administration section. We had to move them to the Building Standards Authority because that was the only available space on the site. I am grateful to them for being able to understand the situation that we found ourselves in. You know, it may not be necessarily the best surroundings because they had to make do in the space that was available. But such is the nature of our people, sir, that sometimes, even though they don't want to agree with what you want to do, they understand that it is for a greater good. And I therefore want to publicly thank the staff that acceded to the request to be able to be temporarily relocated in the Building Standards Unit, those from the Vehicle Admin section, and to hope that by January, when we
Yeah.
Continue, Honourable Member.
Thank you, sir. I don't know how much was captured or lost, but I just will repeat myself because I think it is important for the record to reflect the consideration given by the staff of Licensing Authority in being relocated to another space on the site while the renovations were completed for the Barbados Revenue Authority on the site at the Pine location, and I am eternally grateful to them for being able to understand the situation that presented us. We didn't want the disruption that I'm sure was caused as a result of the BRA office not being at the Pine location to repeat itself, and therefore we asked staff to be able to work together in spaces on the site temporarily to accommodate. It has taken a little longer than we perhaps would have hoped, but I've come to realize that everything takes time, and therefore I am eternally patient when it comes to these matters. Therefore, sir, when January comes, the old office that BRA occupied, which would have had a number of cashier stations, we will have a full complement of the staff there at that particular location. The vehicle administration section, which would answer a number of the customer queries, will be relocated back to its original location. And obviously, in the course of the next few weeks and months, it is our intention to be able to ensure that in terms of the transformation of technology at the licensing authority, that the complaints that have been raised by the public in relation to booking the appointments online and paying online and doing the tests online, I can give the assurance that that is all a work in progress, and the IT teams have been working feverishly to try to complete that particular transformation. Mr. Speaker, I am told that we are having some technical challenges, and the technical crew is going to require at least about 20 minutes in order to have cameras and the audio and everything back up and running. So I will therefore beg to move the suspension of the House until 11:20 a.m., at which time I will continue the introduction of the bills.
The question is that this honorable chamber be suspended until, for 20 minutes. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This honorable chamber stands suspended for 20 minutes.